By November of 1953, much of the excitement from February had died down. The Korean War had been brought to a de facto conclusion the previous July. Dwight Eisenhower, Louis St. Laurent, and Winston Churchill were still the leaders of their respective countries, and Queen Elizabeth II had been coronated the previous June. The affected regions of the UK and Netherlands would still be recovering from the North Sea flood. On November 16th, the final report on the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha was released. This report is the main source for this video. The report is only 13 pages long, with 4 being taken up with information not relevant to the facts of the case. When it came to a cause, the findings were unfortunately predictable. Paragraph 31 provides a summary for why this was the case, citing a lack of evidence and thus a near infinite number of possibilities. Question 15 from the question and answer section sums up its findings as to cause more succinctly, describing it with a single word. Regardless, an effort had been made to find a cause. 16 people were called as witnesses. These were various employees from Skyways, LAC, Rolls-Royce, and various government ministries. In addition to this, 8 affidavits were provided by employees from Lahez Airfield, Captain Ray Hoffman of the Transocean DC-4, the commanding officer of the US CGC Yakutat, and Chesley Fowler, the radio officer from Gander. A number of theories were developed in the report, which we will explore later. For now, I would like to take a look at a few other incidents that may shed some light on the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha. The Aviation Safety Network lists 90 total hull losses involving the Avro York between July of 1944 and March of 1963, with a combined total of 242 fatalities. Compared against the total of 258 built, this means that approximately 35% of all Yorks were lost in accidents. A rather troubling safety record at first glance, though 62 were non-fatal incidents, and the collapse of the main landing gear while on the ground appears to be a common cause of these non-fatal losses, an issue which appears to have plagued other aircraft using the Lancaster's undercarriage. When it occurred, the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha was the deadliest single aircraft accident involving the York. It would unfortunately drop to the second deadliest accident on February 18, 1953, when a Scottish Airlines York suffered an engine fire immediately after takeoff from Malta. Errors made by the crew would result in the aircraft stalling and crashing, an event which was caught on camera. Of particular interest are the 11 other BSAA Yorks. Of these 11 aircraft, 5 were lost in accidents, meaning that a total of half of BSAA Yorks were lost. Going through these in chronological order, the first York lost was also the first York delivered to BSAA. Star Leader crashed at Bathurst in the Gambia colony on September 7, 1946. The plane had just taken off, only to crash 2 miles from the airport, killing all 24 on board. The cause was not definitively determined, but the aircraft was heavily loaded and the captain had little experience with the York. Next, Star Speed was lost at Dakar on April 13, 1947. Pilot error, poor visibility, and lacking airport infrastructure led to the aircraft crash landing, possibly due to fuel exhaustion, killing 6. The third York lost was Star Venture on January 5, 1949. When taking off, the right main gear tire burst. No other damage was observed and the plane continued on. Unbeknownst to the crew, the tire burst had seriously damaged the number 3 engine oil system. 3.5 hours into the flight, the lack of oil caused a series of failures, creating an engine fire. The crew were apparently unable to extinguish the fire, and an emergency landing was attempted at Caravelas, Brazil. Star Venture was barely under control and crash-landed, killing 3. The 3 other incidents occurred after BSAA service. Of course, in 1953, Stardale was lost as Foxtrot Alpha, but remarkably, it wasn't the only BSAA York to disappear. On September 29, 1958, Star Mist, now owned by Middle East Airlines, took off for a cargo flight from Beirut to London with a stopover in Rome. At some point during the flight to Rome, the aircraft was lost. Little information is available on this incident beyond the fact that no trace of the plane and its 5 crew were ever found. Lastly, Star Glitter was lost in a non-fatal landing accident in Oman on September 11, 1962. This was one of the last incidents involving the York. All other BSAA Yorks were scrapped. I also looked at the 23 other fatal incidents involving the Yorks. Of these, 3 strike me as being of some interest to this case. On October 8, 1946, an RAF York was flying between Calcutta and Penang on its way from the UK to the colony of Malaya. The plane would never arrive. Search planes would spot floating wreckage and bodies 160 kilometers west of Penang. It appears that no distress call was made. There is little information on this incident, though the cause was presumably never determined. On June 26, 1954, a former BOAC York, now owned by Skyways of London, was performing a cargo flight between Hamburg and West Berlin. While descending from 7,500 feet in the vicinity of Pirates, East Germany, the outer port engine separated from the aircraft. The plane went out of control and crashed, killing all 3 crew. There is very little information on this incident. As the aircraft crashed behind the Iron Curtain, attempts to investigate the incident may have been hindered by Soviet and East German officials. On May 25, 1958, a former RAF York belonging to Dan Air was making a cargo flight between Karachi and New Delhi. While approaching New Delhi, the outer left engine caught fire. The situation was serious enough that the aircraft was unable to reach an airport, and a crash landing was made in a field. Only a single crew member could be rescued, while the other 4 died. The disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha was the deadliest accident to ever occur involving Skyways. This was nearly exceeded 3 years later on March 4, 1956, when a Handley Page Hermes with 68 passengers on board and an unknown number of crew was being prepared for takeoff. One of the pilots had accidentally slept in and had insisted on eating breakfast before going on duty, delaying the takeoff. While the plane was still on the ground, a bomb went off inside the cargo hold. There were no fatalities, though the aircraft was destroyed. Had it not been delayed, the consequences would have been far more severe. The Bureau of Aircraft Accident Archives lists 13 incidents involving Skyways of London. Beyond the previously mentioned Pirates incident, there are no incidents that appear relevant to the crash of Foxtrot Alpha. A great many aircraft have disappeared while flying to, from, or around Newfoundland and the Azores, according to ASN. To be more specific, 8 aircraft have gone missing around Newfoundland between 1942 and 1990. 7 aircraft have gone missing around the Azores between 1948 and 1969. These numbers include 2 aircraft flying between the Azores and Newfoundland and exclude Foxtrot Alpha. Let's start by looking at the 2 aircraft that crashed flying between the Azores and Newfoundland. First, a Lockheed WV-2 belonging to the U.S. Navy went missing on February 20th, 1958. The WV-2, sometimes referred to as the Willie Victor, is a modified variant of the Lockheed Super Constellation used for airborne early warning patrols. These aircraft were based at Argentia Naval Air Station in Newfoundland, an area known for bad weather. In all but the worst weather, airborne early warning flights would be performed across the Atlantic barrier from here. When conditions were too bad for flights out of Argentia, patrols were flown from La Hez instead. This aircraft was performing a night patrol between Argentia and La Hez. It is believed that the aircraft went down 177 kilometers west of the island of Corvo in the Azores. No trace of it or its 22 crew was ever found despite several days of searching. On January 26, 1961, a U.S. Air Force C-118, a militarized variant of the Douglas DC-6, was about to complete the second leg of its journey from Morocco to Norfolk, Virginia. The plane had been performing a night flight between La Hez and Argentia, and around 3:30 a.m. local time, the plane was approaching its destination. While approximately 50 kilometers northeast of Argentia, over Trinity Bay, something happened to the aircraft. It is apparently believed that the aircraft disintegrated in midair, though why this is the case is not stated. A small quantity of floating debris was found later that morning. The main wreckage and its 23 occupants were not found, despite the aircraft likely going down within 10 miles of the coast. Looking at the other disappearances, 7 appear to be of some interest in relation to Foxtrot Alpha. One incident that immediately stuck out to me was the disappearance of Charlie Foxtrot Alpha Whiskey, a Lockheed Ventura that went missing on April 18, 1953, just 2.5 months after the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha. This aircraft belonged to Spartan Air Services and had been modified for survey work. It had finished a survey mission in Liberia and was being ferried home to Ottawa. During the leg between Gander and Ottawa, the plane and its 4 crew went missing. It is believed that the aircraft crashed in the sea near Gander. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be much info on this case on the internet, so there isn't much to take away from this incident. The somewhat close timing and proximity to the Foxtrot Alpha disappearance is interesting, however. The most famous of these incidents is the disappearance of Star Tiger on January 30th, 1948. This was an Avro Tudor 4 that belonged to BSAA, the corporation that ordered and originally operated Foxtrot Alpha. It was flying between London and Havana, with stopovers at Lisbon, the Azores, and Bermuda. The plane left for Bermuda at 3:34 in the afternoon the previous day. Communication was maintained with the aircraft until 3:13 a.m., when a radio bearing was given to and acknowledged by the crew when the plane was 340 miles from Bermuda. Nothing more was heard from the aircraft, and no trace of it or its 31 occupants were found. This incident became famous as it was one of the mysteries that contributed to the myth of the Bermuda Triangle. I have referred to this incident's report to fill in some details for the disappearance from Foxtrot Alpha due to the similarities between the two cases. On May 5th, 1948, a Douglas C-47 belonging to the Superior Oil Company flying between Gander and Shannon went missing. The search for this aircraft only lasted 5 days, ending on the 10th. No trace of the plane or its 3 crew were found. This suggests that short searches only lasting a few days were not unusual for aircraft that went down under similar circumstances during this era. On the 8th or 9th of March 1969, a Douglas DC-4 belonging to Continental Air Transport went missing between Halifax and the Azores. The search effort for this aircraft only lasted a few days as well, turning up nothing. On October 30th, 1954, a well-equipped U.S. Navy R-7V flying from Maryland to Morocco went missing during the leg to the Azores. After a routine report at 11 p.m., 350 miles east of Maryland, the aircraft went missing. Search operations commenced at 1 a.m. after 2 missed position reports. Conditions during the search were initially favorable, but by November 4th, conditions had deteriorated and the search was abandoned. No trace of the aircraft or its 42 occupants were found. On July 18, 1970, a Soviet Air Force Antonov AN-22 was performing a humanitarian flight between Moscow and Lima. The aircraft was delivering aid to Peru after an earthquake. 47 minutes after leaving Keflavik, the plane disappeared from radar. Despite a combined search effort by the US, Canada, Iceland, and the USSR, no trace of the plane or its 23 occupants were found. September 11, 1990, a Boeing 727 belonging to Fawcett Frew was being ferried home after the end of a lease to Air Malta. Between Reykjavik and Gander, the aircraft apparently went off course and was heard making a distress call by other aircraft. The crew were last heard announcing their intention to ditch due to low fuel. A search lasted a few days and failed to locate any wreckage. No trace of the aircraft or its 16 occupants were found. No cause for the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha was ever found during the investigation. It's clear, however, that a number of theories were considered strong enough to warrant further investigation. Before we get into that, we need to explore the available evidence, including the most important piece of evidence. I believe that the most important piece of evidence in this case is the final transmission. This view appears to be shared by the investigators themselves, who discussed the issue in depth. First, the lack of a 510 POMAR was not considered unusual. The previous POMARs on this flight took up to 25 minutes to be composed and sent. The more significant detail is the use of a 530 position report in this final message. The only time when navigating officer chopping would be expected to determine the position of the aircraft would be for a POMAR. He would be expected to do this at 510 and 610, but not 530. This means that navigating officer chopping and the rest of the crew felt a need to provide a position report earlier than normal. According to the report, it would have taken at least 2 minutes for navigating officer chopping to create this position report. Considering that there would likely have been some discussion and deliberation amongst the crew before the decision to send an urgency call, this would suggest that some sort of issue had begun to develop prior to this point. This would mean that there was some level of alarm by at least 5:28, likely earlier. This was not a great deal of alarm, however. Rather than send a distress call, the crew elected to send a less severe urgency call. Radio Officer Davis sent this message at a normal speed, reinforcing the lack of immediate danger, further reinforced by the fact that Radio Officer Davis appears to have waited for Navigating Officer Chopping to complete his report, rather than send the urgency call immediately. This state of affairs did not last long. Before he could finish his urgency call, Radio Officer Davis suddenly began sending a frantic distress call. This change of message occurred with next to no delay, suggesting that the situation had suddenly escalated. It may have escalated so severely that Radio Officer Davis began sending a distress call of his own accord, rather than after being directed to do so by other crew members, explaining the lack of delay. This frantic message consisted of the distress call prefix, SOS, repeated 3 times, followed by DE. The E is shorthand for this is. The message ended with G-A, This was almost certainly an attempt to give the aircraft's registration of Golf Alpha Hotel Foxtrot Alpha. Before this could be finished, the message broke off. Based on testimony from Gander Radio Officer Fowler, it is believed that this was not a voluntary action by Radio Officer Davis, but instead that the station had gone off the air. Presumably, had Radio Officer Davis been able to complete his distress call, he would have explained the situation aboard Foxtrot Alpha. Unfortunately, he was unable to do so, but his inability to finish his message, and the small portion of the message we know, provides some very useful evidence in and of itself. Based on these radio communications, it would appear that the aircraft began encountering some sort of issue between 4:10 and 5:28 that, by 5:30, warranted a distress call. This concerning but not overtly dangerous situation suddenly escalated at 5:31 to warrant a sudden distress call. This sudden danger further escalated within seconds to silence the aircraft before the distress call could be finished. This set of circumstances can help when narrowing down what possibly happened to Foxtrot Alpha. Theory, which might seem compelling at first, is the possibility of weather-related factors. The report, however, points out numerous issues with this theory. Weather forecasts from Lahez indicated weather was expected to be decent at the time of the disappearance, with no turbulence or icing expected. According to Foxtrot Alpha's POMARs and the testimony of Captain Hoffman from the Transocean DC-4, the weather forecasts were broadly accurate. A cold front traveling east from Newfoundland reached the search area before searchers could, but it had not reached the area when the 5:31 distress call was made. Even though the weather may not have caused the incident, that does not mean it couldn't have affected the result. The important early hours of the search were hindered by the bad weather. Debris and possible survivors could have been pushed far from the search area. Not that survivors were likely. Besides the sudden end of the distress call, suggesting a sudden and violent end to the aircraft, the York was not known for having good ditching characteristics. Being a high-wing monoplane, most of the fuselage would immediately sink below the waves on impact with the water. The only way to escape would be using the emergency hatches on the roof. The ladders for these would have had to be folded down, and 39 people would have to climb out onto the roof. In addition to this, the crew would have to go to the back of the baggage hold, gather the life rafts, and the other survival equipment, pass them up the hatches, and prepare them, and all of this had to be done before the York sank, an aircraft whose ditching characteristics in ideal conditions were described in the report as follows. Quote, "It is unlikely that the aircraft could remain afloat for more than a few seconds after even a fully controlled descent onto smooth water." End quote. In worse conditions, like, say, the North Atlantic, shortly before a storm arrived in the area, the report is even more grave. Quote, "In a rough sea, the aircraft would almost certainly break up almost immediately." Unsurprisingly, the report considered it unlikely that anyone could have survived a ditching. The report recommended that a method of external stowage and automatic or remote-controlled release should be researched for aircraft with poor ditching characteristics. Looking at the operator's handbook from July of 1946, the system was already implemented on some Yorks, but not Foxtrot Alpha. The system depicted in the handbook shows a single remote-controlled dinghy in the left wing, while all the other dinghies were stored in the rear. Given the previously stated issues with the York, Finding a way of expanding this system to launch all dinghies quickly may have been desirable. It is unclear if this was ever implemented, though. One theory that investigators looked at related to the weather was the possibility of icing. According to the forecast from Lahez and reports made by Foxtrot Alpha and the Transocean DC-4, no more than light icing would have been encountered. The cold front moving in from the west would have brought more severe icing, but Foxtrot Alpha had disappeared before it had reached the storm. LAC already had strict rules forbidding pilots from flying in dangerous icing conditions. Foxtrot Alpha was equipped with adequate de-icing equipment and was certified for flight in all icing conditions for an indefinite amount of time. This theory is unique in that the report explicitly states that this theory is unlikely. This was primarily based on the aforementioned weather reports. The only reason this theory seems to get much attention from the investigators is due to the certificate of airworthiness. This had stated that the aircraft was certified for flight under any icing condition for an indefinite amount of time. The report notes that this had not actually been tested and appears to have been suspicious of this claim, recommending that some sort of limitation should be mandated on aircraft regarding the severity and duration of icing they were allowed to fly in. As previously stated, however, icing could not have caused the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha. Another factor that appears to have greatly interested the investigators was the issue of crew fatigue. LAC's operation manual recommended that captains should plan their flights such that for every 9 hours on duty, the crew receives 9 hours of rest. If more than 12 hours are flown in one day, a rest period of at least 12 hours should be allowed. Captains were given the authority to bend these rules as they saw fit. Captain Nichols wasn't so much bending these rules as completely ignoring them. By the time the plane arrived at Lahez, the crew had been on duty for at least 9 hours. They should have taken a 9-hour rest break had they been following the LAC procedures. Instead, after spending a little over 4 hours preparing the plane for the flight to Gander, the aircraft took off. The crew was on duty for over 13 hours at this point. The crew would have arrived at Gander after 23 hours on duty, and the distress call was made after 19 hours on duty. The report pays significant attention to the issue of crew fatigue, with 2 of the recommendations focused on this issue. Specifically, recommending that operators should provide schedules for their crews rather than leaving it up to them, as well as additional research into crew fatigue. For all the attention the report gives to the issue of fatigue, it is doubtful that it was the primary cause of the accident. It may have been a secondary cause, reducing the performance of the crew during an emergency, but given the sudden nature of the accident, fatigue may not have had any effect at all. Another odd conclusion from the report is question 6 from the question and answer section. This states that the crew were adequately experienced for the journey to Jamaica. This is questionable, as while the crew were generally experienced, neither Captain Nichols nor First Officer Walton had any previous experience on transatlantic flights. In addition to this, Navigating Officer Chopping, Radio Officer Davis, and Engineering Officer Lawrence only had 5 transatlantic flights under their belts. Whether this could have potentially affected the flight is unclear. Another possibility explored in the report was the issue of control failure. The specific reason for this was the incident on the 31st, where the elevators were blown about due to an error by the ground crew. The report stated that this incident likely had no effect on this incident, but regardless, strongly criticized the ground crew and their failure to install gust locks. A recommendation was made for operators to enforce greater discipline on ground crews to prevent similar incidents. Though the report put little stock in the possibility of the accident being caused by this incident, I think it warrants a further look. Given the evidence of the final message, the only possible damage caused by the January 31st incident that could possibly cause an accident of a sudden nature is the failure of the elevator controls. These were visually inspected after the incident and were found to be serviceable. Given that the aircraft was due to depart the following morning and the inspector was unlicensed, it is possible that there were undetected issues with the aircraft, though again the report did consider this inspection to be satisfactory and believed the elevator controls were fine. I decided to look at ASN's list of incidents caused by elevator issues, and I found 5 incidents that might have been of some relevance to this incident. On January 19th, 1955, a Convair 340 belonging to United Airlines was flying from Newark, New Jersey to Lincoln, Nebraska, with multiple stopovers that had been completed without incident. Several minutes after leaving Des Moines, Iowa, a vibration from the control column was noted while the aircraft was climbing through 5,000 feet. The climb stopped at 6,000 feet as the crew tried to troubleshoot the issue. As the crew was trying to contact United Airlines to advise them of the situation, a sudden control failure occurred. Elevator control was significantly reduced and the plane was unable to maintain altitude. A further control failure occurred, resulting in a steep climb. The captain applied maximum power, causing a steep dive. He was able to recover and made a crash landing in a cornfield 6 miles southeast of Dexter, Iowa. All 39 people on board survived. The aircraft had recently undergone a 1,500-hour inspection that had been finished earlier that day. During the inspection, the elevator servo tab was identified as needing replacement. No replacement part could be found, and the mechanics decided to ignore company policy by replacing the part pending the arrival of a replacement without taking the proper precautions. The next shift was not informed of this repair and did not notice any issue with the elevators. This botched repair lasted for 5 hours of flight before causing a failure in the right elevator and significantly reducing the functionality of the left elevator. On April 1st, 1958, a Skyways Handley Page Hermes was performing a test flight out of London Stansted Airport. The controls became jammed due to a small, unspecified object becoming stuck in the elevator system. The plane crashed, killing all 3 on board. On May 14th, 1958, a U.S. Navy R-7V was flying between Ontario Airport in California to Moffett Field near San Francisco. During the flight, the aircraft entered 5 consecutive stalls, losing 3,000 feet of altitude and suffering severe structural damage. The aircraft broke apart and crashed near Taft, California. On May 6, 1981, a U.S. Air Force EC-135 departed Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for a routine training mission. 45 minutes into the mission, while flying over Maryland at 29,000 feet, the plane vanished from radar. Its wreckage was found near the town of Walkersville, the aircraft having broken up in midair, and all 21 occupants had been killed. An investigation by the U.S. Air Force found that the pitch trim moved itself into the fold-down position for unknown reason. In a matter of seconds, control was lost, and the plane entered a rapid descent, exploding shortly before impacting the ground. It appears as though no distress call was made. On February 24, 1999, A Tu-154 was making a routine flight between Chengdu and Wenzhou. The flight was normal until descending through 9,000 meters, when the pilots noticed that the control column was too far forward. The column gradually moved forward until reaching the fully forward position. Despite this, the aircraft appeared to be under control and the plane continued to its destination. While approaching the airport, the flaps were deployed. The aircraft went out of control, stalled, and crashed into a field, killing all 61 occupants, and injuring or possibly killing an unspecified number of farmers on the ground. The crash had been caused by a maintenance error. The wrong type of nut was used to secure a bolt in the elevator control system. This nut gradually unscrewed itself, causing the loss of the bolt and the failure of the pitch control. The report notes that it is unlikely that an aircraft with severe elevator control damage could make a successful 8-hour flight and complete 6 hours of another flight before losing control. This is a well-founded criticism, as most of the incidents listed in the previously mentioned ASN list involve aircraft crashing immediately after takeoff or failing to take off in the first place. The crashes of United Airlines Flight 329 and China Southwest Airlines Flight 4509 demonstrate that elevator control issues can occur gradually while an aircraft is in flight, while the crash of Agar 23 shows that a loss of control can be sudden and violent, resulting in little chance for the crew to react or make a distress call. It is conceivable that serious damage had been done to the elevator controls by the wind gusts on the 31st. The damage might have been missed during the inspection and not be serious enough to manifest itself during the first 14 hours of flight between then and the loss of the aircraft. Then, after 14 hours of flight, the damaged parts finally broke and caused the crash. The main problem I see with this are as follows. First, this scenario conflicts with the conditions of the final message. As seen with the 5 elevator control failures discussed previously, these incidents either start as minor issues that gradually escalate, like those seen on flights 329 and 4509, or sudden and violent, like Agar 23. It seems doubtful that any incident like these would have produced a situation which would warrant an urgency call, suddenly escalate to warrant a frantic distress call, only to further escalate within seconds to prematurely end the call. These incidents either seem to give crews enough time to give a full urgency or distress call, or are so sudden that no radio messages of any kind are sent. Second, while control issues can crop up mid-flight, most reveal themselves during the earliest stages of a flight. With that in mind, it seems unlikely, though not necessarily impossible, that an aircraft could survive 14 hours of flight without any apparent issue before suddenly crashing. Overall, this theory does have some credibility, but there are still a number of issues and unanswered questions that prevent this from being a particularly strong theory. Another theory that was explored in the report was the possibility of fuel contamination. The fuel bowser that was used to load 2,085 gallons of fuel was immediately quarantined by officials at La Hez after learning that Foxtrot Alpha was missing. Fuel from the bowser was tested and found to be free of contaminants. Another possible source of contamination was considered as well. While the aircraft was sitting at La Hez, Engineering Officer Lawrence not only refilled the fuel tanks, but also filled the water tanks with 50 to 60 gallons of water. This is potentially of note, as the wing center tank is located near the water tanks. This introduces the possibility of Engineering Officer Lawrence accidentally putting water in the fuel tank. Since the crew was already exceeding their recommended time on duty, this may have increased the chance of such a mistake occurring. Like the elevator control failure theory, This was dismissed in the report, and like that theory, I'm going to give it a closer look. Looking at ASN's list of fuel contamination incidents reveals that water entering the fuel supply is the most common cause of fuel contamination. A great many incidents of this nature have occurred, though I have found three that are particularly interesting with regards to this case. On August 3rd, 1935, a Douglas DC-2 was making its way from Los Angeles, California to Newark, New Jersey with multiple stopovers. During a stopover at Albuquerque, New Mexico, the plane was loaded with 80-octane fuel. During the takeoff and climb, 87-octane fuel was used, while 80-octane fuel was used during the cruise. Sometime around when Flight 6 took off, another aircraft that had taken off from Albuquerque and had been filled with 80-octane fuel there encountered engine problems when transferring from 87 to 80-octane fuel. The engines quit, but the crew were able to restart them and diagnose the cause. They attempted to contact Flight 6 to warn them of the fuel issues, but this message came too late. Flight 6 had switched to 80-octane fuel while passing through 9,300 feet, and by the time the plane reached 9,500 feet, both engines had failed. The pilots were unable to restart the engines and were forced to make a crash landing at night. With the help of the other aircraft, the crew found a pasture and made a crash landing east of Albuquerque. All 11 occupants survived. Examination of the fuel storage system at Albuquerque found that a 5,000-gallon fuel tank had a design flaw which allowed water to leak in through an air vent if enough water was present. An unusually high amount of rainfall had occurred the previous afternoon. On April 29, 1979, a Mitsubishi MU-2 belonging to International Business Aircraft Incorporated was flying from Iola, Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri. During the cruise, the aircraft lost both engines and was forced to make an emergency landing at Gander, Kansas. All three occupants survived. A fuel truck which was used to fuel the aircraft was found to have water in its tank. On March 20th, 1994, a Canadair Challenger belonging to Crystal Air Aviation was being ferried from Boston, Massachusetts to its home base in Long Beach, California. The plane was originally supposed to refuel at Lawrence, Massachusetts, but the fuel truck broke down before the refueling operation was completed. It was decided that the plane would make a stop at Burlington, Vermont, and take on the necessary fuel for the flight to California. As the plane was taxiing to the runway, the crew were informed that water had been found inside the fuel truck. Testing of the aircraft's fuel found water was present in the tank, but only in small amounts. The flight to Burlington was uneventful apart from unusual fluctuations from the fuel gauges. The plane was refueled at Burlington and took off for Long Beach. During the flight, a warning light for the left engine turned on. About 2.5 hours after takeoff, while the aircraft was flying over Nebraska, the warning light turned off. Shortly afterwards, the left engine began to fail, followed by the right engine. The pilots attempted to make an emergency landing at Bassett, but came down in a crop field. Both pilots survived. Water contamination incidents usually involve the engines suddenly quitting with little warning. It seems as though the effects of water contamination can take some time to manifest. As was seen with TWA Flight 6, an aircraft can fly for a while on a clean tank of fuel before encountering issues when switching to another tank. To better understand the possibility of fuel contamination taking down Foxtrot Alpha, we need to take a closer look at the fuel system and procedures of the York. Foxtrot Alpha was filled with 2,085 gallons of fuel, while the York had a maximum of 2,478 gallons. Likely the 393-gallon difference was the fuel left over from the previous flight. The fuel is divided amongst 7 tanks. Of most interest is the wing center tank, located in the upper fuselage between the wings. This tank is near the water tanks. It is not known how Engineering Officer Lawrence loaded the aircraft with fuel. It is likely that this could not be known without the testimony of the crew, as Engineering Officer Lawrence did this alone. To try and figure out how he may have filled the fuel tanks, and possibly how he may have contaminated them, we need to look at the procedures regarding fuel. The order in which the fuel tanks were used was left up to the pilots, but a few recommendations were made. 1. The number 3 tanks should be used as early as possible. 2. The aircraft was easier to control in turbulent conditions with the number 2 and 3 tanks empty. And 3. Fuel for the engines should not be provided by a tank which is having fuel transferred into it. The recommended order of use for the tanks as summarized was to use the number 2 tanks until they drop below 180 gallons, switch to the number 1 tanks and empty the number 3 tanks into the number 2 tanks. When the number 1 tanks are at 80 gallons, switch to the number 2 tanks and empty the wing center tank into the number 1 tanks. Switch to the number 1 tanks when the number 2 tanks are almost empty and continue the rest of the flight on the number 1 tanks. It is during this final switch that the possible fuel contamination from the wing center tank could cause issues. In order to figure out when this final switch might have occurred, I used the fuel consumption chart from the pilot's and flight engineer's notes. The exact configuration of the aircraft is not known, which makes fuel calculations difficult. In addition to this, the report is not clear as to whether the aircraft was at 8,000 or 10,000 feet. I decided to make 3 estimates. I created a very low and very high estimate to give a minimum and maximum amount of fuel used, and a more realistic, moderate estimate. I created a very low and very high estimate to give a minimum and maximum amount of fuel used, and a more realistic, moderate estimate. I then calculated how long it would take for a York flying under these conditions to deplete enough fuel to switch to a contaminated wing center tank. The final distress call was sent approximately 6 hours after leaving the heads. Not even the highly exaggerated maximum consumption estimate sees the crew switching to the refilled number 1 tanks this early into the flight. It is conceivable that the crew would not follow the recommended procedure, but considering the incoming storm, they presumably would have wanted to empty the number 2 and number 3 tanks first, thus following the recommended procedure. Since the flight to Gander was well within the maximum range of the York, it's possible that Foxtrot Alpha may not have needed to use the wing center tank at all. The flight to Gander would have taken about 10 hours, while the moderate consumption estimate would have taken 9.9 hours to switch to the wing center tank. If the switch did occur, then it likely would have happened when the aircraft was near or over Newfoundland, much later in the flight. There are other reasons to doubt this theory. The report points out that the fuel and water tank caps are differently positioned, sized, and shaped, likely to prevent the accidental mixing of the two. It is also questionable whether a fuel contamination incident would produce the conditions of the final message. If water contaminated the number 1 tanks and they were used, the effects would likely be very sudden, meaning the crew would likely not issue an emergency call. If it became clear that the engines were going to fail, it would warrant a frantic distress call. The loss of the engines would result in the loss of all generators aboard the aircraft. More specifically, the loss of the engines would require the crew to feather the propellers to reduce drag. While the propellers are unfeathered, they would be windmilling and presumably producing some quantity of electrical power via the generators. Once feathered, no electricity would be produced. These wouldn't be the only sources of electricity aboard the aircraft, however. The batteries would be unaffected and would still provide power to the aircraft until they were exhausted. This would take far longer than a few seconds, meaning that Radio Officer Davis would have been able to finish his message rather than suddenly cutting out. In addition to this, the pilots likely wouldn't immediately feather the propellers. As previously discussed, a ditching in the sea was a death sentence for all on board. Similarly to TWA Flight 6, they would want to do everything they could to restart the engines before ditching. This would involve not feathering the propellers, meaning that the generators would still be producing some electricity. And for these reasons, it would appear that fuel contamination was unlikely. The final theory put forward by the report was an engine fire. This appears to have been one of the most interesting theories to the investigators, as 4 of 9 paragraphs of the comment and discussion section pertain to this possibility. In addition, 2 of 7 recommendations also relate to this theory. This appears to be well grounded. The previously discussed crashes of Echo X-ray near Kiravelis and Uniform Victor near New Delhi are examples of York suffering severe fires that quickly forced the aircraft down. Uniform Victor is a particularly striking case, as the aircraft was in a very favorable position at the time of the fire breaking out, already being on approach to an airport. Despite this, the fire became so severe that the crew were forced to make a crash landing, and only a single crew survived. Also worth considering is the crash of November Yankee near Kyrens. This aircraft suddenly went out of control due to the separation of the outer left engine. These show that even a single engine failure can have catastrophic consequences. The report seems to hint at a more specific scenario. It is stated that a possible cause for an engine fire is the loss of lubricating oil. This was the cause of the fire and crash of Echo X-ray in Brazil. The oil pressure and temperature gauges are located on the lower part of the pilot's instrument panel near the compass. This is an area that may have been difficult to see in a dark cockpit. If a leak was not detected quickly enough, this could result in a very dangerous situation, possibly including a fire. Another flaw noted by the report was the inability to transfer the fire extinguisher contents between engines. This meant that if a fire was not extinguished by that engine's extinguisher, there was no other way of putting it out. It should also be remembered that the starboard inner engine had issues prior to takeoff. These were apparently fixed by replacing the spark plugs, but it's possible that this was just concealing a more serious problem. Combined, these facts reveal a potential scenario. At some point during the flight, oil began to leak from one or more of the engines. The crew failed to detect the leak for some time. Shortly before 5:30, the crew finally detected the issue and sent an emergency call. Before it's completed, a fire starts and a distress call is sent. The issue with the theory happens at this point. The report did not see how an engine fire could escalate abruptly enough to end the urgency call and prompt the crew to start sending a distress call, let alone cutting off said message. Looking at the crashes of Echo X-ray in Brazil, Uniform Victor in India, and November Yankee in East Germany did give me an idea, however. I looked at ASN's list of engine separation incidents focused on fatal incidents involving propeller-driven aircraft and found some interesting results. On August 6, 1955, an Aeroflot Ilyushin IL-14 was flying between Volgograd and Moscow. Prior to the flight, a possible oil leak was detected in the right engine, but there did not appear to be any other issues. A little over an hour and a half into the flight, the right engine caught on fire. An emergency landing was attempted at Voronezh, but 8 minutes after the start of the emergency, the fire had weakened the engine to the point where it fell off, followed shortly afterwards by the right wing. All 25 on board were killed. On October 28, 1957, an Iberia DC-3 was flying between Tangier and Madrid. 4 minutes after a routine communication, a fire erupted in the left engine. 2 minutes later, the engine separated from the aircraft, which then went out of control. All 21 on board were killed. On January 18, 1988, a China Southwest Airlines Aleutian IL-18 was flying between Beijing and Chongqing. During the flight, the number 4 engine failed and was feathered. 7 minutes later, the engine caught fire and broke off the wing shortly afterward. The aircraft went out of control and crashed, killing all 108 on board. An oil line connecting to the feathering system for the number 4 engine had been damaged by heat and had begun leaking after the propellers were feathered. It would combust a few minutes later. These incidents show that an engine fire can cause an engine separation in a short period of time, and that engine separation can result in a catastrophic loss of control. Situations like these could have occurred to Foxtrot Alpha. Looking at the crash of the IL-14 near Voronezh, seemingly minor engine problems were noted before the plane left Volgograd. Foxtrot Alpha's starboard inner engine produced unusual vibrations prior to the flight. These were apparently fixed, but it's possible that these repairs didn't solve the underlying issue. As previously mentioned, the crew had significantly exceeded their recommended duty time, were trying to perform these repairs early in the morning, and were likely fatigued. This may have reduced their ability to identify the issue properly. Also of interest is the amount of time between the first sign of trouble and the separation. In the case of the IL-14, this was 8 minutes. In the case of the Iberia DC-3, this took only 2 to 6 minutes. These times seem a little too long for Foxtrot Alpha, where the first sign of alarm came prior to 5:28, and the sudden escalation of the distress call occurred at 5:31. That being said, they are still quite close. With this in mind, we can finish the scenario from earlier. An engine, possibly the starboard inner engine, fails or is shut down due to some malfunction. The York can fly on 3 engines and is nearing Newfoundland, so the aircraft is not in immediate danger. Navigating Officer Chopping takes a few minutes to prepare a position report, and Radio Officer Davis begins sending out an urgency call. There is concern, but not immediate alarm amongst the crew, explaining the calm nature of the urgency call. While he is sending the call, something serious occurs. Perhaps the damaged engine separated or caught fire. Whatever it was immediately clear that the aircraft was in danger, perhaps so clear that Radio Officer Davis did not need instruction from the rest of the crew to begin sending a distress call. Within seconds, the crisis involving the engine escalated further. Perhaps the separation happened at this point, severely damaging the wing and causing it to fail. Perhaps the ongoing fire or separation a few seconds earlier had caused serious damage to the wing, resulting in its failure at this point. The aircraft became uncontrollable, perhaps disintegrating prior to impacting the sea, and Radio Officer Davis was thus unable to finish his message. The cold front hinders initial search efforts, and by the time the searchers are able to properly start the search, debris was blown far away from the search area, except perhaps the reported oil and dye slick, and after a few days, when it's clear that there are no survivors, the search is called off. After many hours of studying and recreating the York, and researching this case and many others that were similar to it in some way, I have come to the conclusion that this is the most likely scenario in which Foxtrot Alpha and its 39 occupants were lost, though I am not entirely confident in it. 72 years after the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha, no trace of it has ever been found. At this point, it seems unlikely that anything ever will be found, barring some incredible stroke of luck. The disappearance has since faded into obscurity. As such, the incident hasn't left much of a legacy. That isn't to say the incident had no legacy at all, though. According to Larry Cush's Bermuda Triangle Solved, some attempt was made to force the incident into the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. By 1975, when the book was first published, the disappearance had been associated with the Bermuda Triangle by some. This may have been the result of someone seeing that the aircraft had been flying between the UK and Jamaica and had gone missing shortly before arriving at an airport, then simply assumed that the plane must have gone down in the supposed triangle. Alternatively, this could be the result of a more cynical effort to exaggerate the number of aircraft to disappear in the triangle. Whatever the reason, basic knowledge of geography and a look at the aircraft's true flight path proved this association to be utterly ridiculous, with the last known position being over 2,100 kilometers or 1,300 miles north of Bermuda. Modern lists of aircraft that went missing in or around the triangle do not include Foxtrot Alpha, so it seems that those looking for disappearances to blame on the Bermuda Triangle have learned to read maps since 1975. On a more positive note, it seems that the disappearance may have prompted the Canadian government to improve search and rescue efforts around Newfoundland. In April of 1953, just 2 months after the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha, the RCAF would reactivate its base at Torbay, near St. John's, and station search and rescue aircraft there. This would become the No. 107 Rescue Unit in 1954. I couldn't find any mention of this being due to Foxtrot Alpha, but the timing and location seem to line up with some attempt to improve search and rescue in the region Foxtrot Alpha went missing. If so, this would at least leave a positive legacy to the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha.